like BARD and Beacon and NEST that admit students based on a variety of factors like admissions, state test scores and grades and teacher recommendations and portfolios and other measures. But the specialized high schools are create an interesting phenomenon. Okay, they're the percentage of low-income kids that get into the specialized high schools is much higher than the percentage of kids who are getting into the percentage of low-income kids who are getting into the screened high schools. And a lot of that is because these schools have traditionally been places where kids from immigrant families, kids from low-income backgrounds can demonstrate their knowledge on this test and get into this academic environment where, you know, nerds can flourish. You know, they can do well in math. Okay, they can study for this exam, and they have an equal playing field to compete with kids from, you know, more privileged backgrounds.
I'm going to cut you off there and
okay.
ask Jonathan, do you think the test should be scrapped?
I need to turn it on.
Yeah.
Thanks. I think that admissions based on one test only is an idea that should be scrapped, but I don't think that the test should be scrapped. I think the test needs to be revised, and I think it needs to be, and I can elaborate if you want, part of what we look at. Should I go on?
We'll stop for there. And then,
Okay.
Ed, do you want to just want to lay the cards on the table here so you know who we're talking to? So.
The short answer is I don't believe the test should be scrapped. Like Jonathan, that doesn't mean it doesn't need to be looked at and revised in some way, and you know that is would be the work of, you know, the people who do this kind of work in testing, along with educators, to make sure that we're testing for the right things. And I think that's part of the controversy. I know some of the arguments against the existing test is that it's not aligned with the curriculum, and I think that's a legitimate consideration, and I think it needs to be aired out. So that's the short answer.
That's the short answer. Let's go to Rachel now. And
so I'll be brief since most of what I'm going to say about it has already been said by my co-panelists. But yeah, I don't think that the test itself needs to necessarily be scrapped. I think it's something we need to look at, but I strongly agree that there should be a multiple measures admissions policy. So a test could be part of that, a test like the SHSAT, which is a multiple choice test. I think that any test that is used, first of all, as we discussed, needs to be aligned to the curriculum. And second of all, needs to be validated for its use. And I know that is a term of art, but there haven't been any studies, at least that we know of, that show that the SHSAT actually, or the SHSAT, I apologize, actually tests the skills that you need to flourish at these schools. We know that kids are flourishing at these schools, but my guess is that, and I hope, a large part of that is because these schools are great schools, and so you're going to see successful outcomes, whether or not these tests are actually testing for who's, the most meritorious or who's going to be, really deserves to be in them. So I think there needs to be some validation of any test that is used.
What's wrong with having 73% Asian kids at a school like Stuyvesant? Medgar Evers has 93% black. It's a top-notch school, sends a lot of kids to college. Nobody says we need more Asian kids at Medgar Evers. What's wrong with having 73% of kids Asian at Stuyvesant? Anybody?
I'll jump in and say there's nothing wrong with having 73% Asian kids. I don't think I think that angle is the wrong way to come at the problem. The problem is that Black and Latino children are being locked out of the opportunity. And so there is a real problem with our top public schools, and there are other wonderful schools in the city, and that is absolutely true. But these, have a stellar reputation. People see them as tickets to the best place, and Black and Latino kids aren't getting in for some reason, and that is a problem. So You know, and you know, I think Chris said something about overrepresentation before, and I don't believe in that term at all. Sorry, Chris. I just meant that I don't think there's such a thing as overrepresentation, but there definitely is a thing as underrepresentation in this case, and I think that's the way we need to look at the problem.
Michael, tell me, on the phone earlier today, you told me about a black kid who had 562, had a very high score on the Stuyvesant test and decided not to go. Explain to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in my program in Upper Manhattan, we primarily have Hispanic kids and some black kids in the program because it's in Washington Heights. We draw kids from Harlem and Washington Heights in the South Bronx. We had a kid a couple years ago who probably had one of the highest scores in the city, and I think he was turned off by the outreach effort that that the Stuyvesant Diversity Group does at the school. He felt like, you know, his father really felt like he didn't want his son to be, you know, like part of a social experiment. They're putting so much attention on this test and the racial issue, and it's, you know, it's being written about every year in the media, and he wanted him to have sort of a more normal experience in high school. But that being said, every year we have black kids and Hispanic kids come from my program and enter Stuyvesant and love it there and have a great time there. And to get to your question, I just want to say there's absolutely nothing wrong with the schools being 73% Asian. I want to point out that the term Asian, as the DOE defines it, encompasses a lot of different groups. Okay, there are Bengali groups, Korean groups, Chinese groups, lots of different groups who are doing well on this exam. Okay, they're primarily low-income kids. Okay, who are sometimes investing, you know, quite a bit of money in test prep. Okay, but these are parents who want the best for their kids, who are pushing them to study and prepare for these exams. And they come into these schools and they are on another level from kids who haven't prepared for this exam to get ready for this challenging experience.
Jonathan, from teaching at High School of American Studies, how has the school changed, you know, in the years that you've been there?
So I was in the first group of teachers in American Studies. We started in 2002. So I've been there, except for my sabbatical year, I've been there for every single year. And the first thing I want to say is it's been a great school and it still is a great school. We've had great students and we still have great students. And I don't want to, by saying something really good about a particular group, I don't want to say anything negative about anybody else. Echoing panelists, there's nothing wrong. But at our, not immediately when we started, but within a couple of years, we became an incredibly diverse school. There was a point where we were maybe 30% white, 20% Asian, encompassing all of that, what that means, 25% black and 25% Hispanic. And the dynamic, and it wasn't just varied in terms of race, but in terms of neighborhood, in terms of class, what their parents did. And the dynamic in our classes, the quality of the discussion, the quality of the interaction was just off the charts. Diversity benefited every single person in the room. And we're still a great school, and we still have great students, but I think that we've really lost that, and I think we really feel that strongly.
If you want to add anything to that.
Well, you know, going back to the original question that you posed about the test, I think the issue, we hope at least most of us will agree, is much more complicated than just the test. And I agree that when we have diversity within our schools, whether it's economic diversity, intellectual diversity, racial diversity, that's a good thing. And we need to do a better job in making sure that our schools are diverse. But I have a however. And I think that however is really about making sure that we're looking at the root cause of the problem in terms of why aren't there more African American students? Why aren't there more Hispanic students? Why aren't there more females in our specialized schools? And I would argue that all you have to do is look at our test scores, and you can start in grade 8, grade 7, and go all the way back to grade 3. I've isolated just the grade 7 test scores, and it tells me that
Of the 18,467 African American students in grade 7 who took the ELA test, only 1.9% of the over 18,000 students who took it scored at a level 4. And of the 27,000 Hispanic students who took the grade 7 ELA exam, only 2.1. And this is just totally not acceptable. So I think that as we have this discussion today, it is an ideal opportunity to look at the root cause of the problem and address the whole problem at its root, as well as all of the contributing factors, in addition to the test perhaps, that may be contributing to this racial isolation.
Rachel, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure, yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more that the inequalities and systemic inequalities and access to quality education in New York City, the problems go back way before kids are taking this test, right? And one of the things about Sean Corcoran's study that Chris didn't have a chance to mention was that it really showed that the sorting that happens is, in terms of who's going to get into a specialized high school, starts all the way back when the kids are 4 or 5, taking gifted and talented tests, being tracked, all of those things. And so the inequality goes way back, and they're fixing the admissions policy to specialized high schools is not going to fix our entire systemic problem in New York City. So I don't want anyone to think that we're certainly at LDF that we're making that argument. The thing here is that we're faced with a policy, a single test to get in for making a very high stake decision that's compounding the inequities. It's mirroring the inequities that have been throughout the system, rather than taking it as an opportunity to give people who can demonstrate merit in other ways, other than that gifted and talented test when they were 4, people who have excelled in really hard situations and are the valedictorian of their class at a school, but maybe didn't do as well in the SHSAT, to give those people opportunity and to really actually change the dynamic that we've been seeing throughout the entire system. So it's just an opportunity to do that. It's not going to fix all of the other problems.
I want to jump in and talk about girls a little bit, because there is, we know that there's deep inequity, racial inequities in our society, and that Black and Latino kids tend to be in schools that don't have gifted and talented programs, that are not as strong as the schools that the white kids go to. But girls go to the same schools as boys, and yet they are even accounting for their 7th grade standardized test scores. They don't apply at the same rate to the specialized schools. They're not admitted at the same rate as the specialized schools, and then they don't accept at the same rate even if they're admitted. So what's going on there? I mean, it seems like there's something wrong. To me, it seems like that says, as a girl, I think that says there's something wrong with the test. Michael, who actually prepares kids to take this test. So.
Well, first I'll say I have more girls than boys in both the programs that we run. One in Upper Manhattan and one in at Brooklyn Tech. And I think there are a lot of high-performing 7th grade girls, in terms of the state test, who have 4s on both exams. And I think in terms of, sometimes I think maybe on average, girls tend to have better study habits than the boys, I think. At
that age, at least.
Yeah, at that age, yeah. And
I don't mean to trash boys as a group, some of the boys.
So I think, I think there are a lot of, there are more issues with girls. I saw this particularly when we were in the Bronx one year. Sometimes parents are more reluctant to have girls travel long distances to a high school. I think that's one issue, maybe with the acceptance rate. I think more could be done, I guess, to promote. Most of these schools are viewed as science high schools. Stuyvesant, Brooklyn Tech, and Bronx Science are more traditionally science high schools, and more could be done, I think, to promote girls getting into those careers and interest in those careers. But I don't want to spread the message that girls can't perform on this exam in the same way. I think if they prepare well, they can do just as well as the boys. I've seen that in my program. So, and I just want to add one point. And the test, it's part of the Department of Education contract, okay, to analyze the test for bias. And they analyze it for racial bias, for gender bias, and for socioeconomic bias. And that does happen, so it's validated on that basis every year.
I remember when I was a kid, I took the SATs and the word was gridiron, and I had no idea what gridiron was. So they didn't, maybe I was the only girl that didn't know that word.
It's more science passages these days.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is that Hunter College High School, which is not an it has a different exam, has always had more girls than boys, and they have a lot of female heads of science departments there, and they've done a lot of those. There are a lot of girls in the computer science, a lot of girls in the medical science programs, and one of the things that they've discovered is that girls don't really like competition; they prefer teamwork, and so instead of doing things like the Intel Science, they do something called Purple Comet, which is sort of teamwork in science rather than individual success. And I think with girls in the SATs, the guys tend to have this sort of let me at 'em attitude towards the tests where, I don't know, is anybody else having a thought about the...
Can I say one thing?
And that girl, I just have a quick note.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, I think that, bias testing or not, we're seeing that they're not doing as well, right? Because it's what as Clara was saying, it's not just who's applying and who's accepting, but also how they're doing once they are taking the test. I could not in a million years explain to you why that's happening, but I do think it introduces another reason why you want to introduce multiple measures and why multiple measures are an accepted form sort of throughout the country, and in higher education as well. In fact, there was the book that came out a few years ago called Exam Schools, which basically says that the New York specialized high schools are now the only high schools, competitive high schools in the country that are using only a multiple choice exam. So, and even Hunter has like a grade cutoff, right? So there's something before you can take it. So there's another measure introduced. And so the more measures you introduce, whether or not you understand where the bias is coming from, you start to eliminate some of that bias, right? If you have grades and a test, then some of the bias, whatever it is that's producing it in this test, whether or not it's being caught in the bias testing, the effect of that starts to go down. And so I think the fact that we see girls on top of African Americans and Latinos not doing as well is yet another reason to think about introducing.
Oh, that was my next question, actually, so you're fine. So the question is, would this be a fair way? You're the very best kid in your middle school in the Bronx, even though you're not as good as some other kids. Michael, tell me about your kids at MS-80 in the Bronx.
Okay, so one year we had a principal who came to me and said, it was a turnaround school, so it was a failing school, and she said, why don't you come into our school and prepare our honors 6th grade and 7th grade class for the specialized high school exam, because that test is a great way to improve your skills for the performance on the state exams and grades in school, because the test is a cumulative achievement test on all those subjects over time. It basically tests all the math that you might have learned over your entire academic career. So we went into this school, and I was shocked, okay? This school was in Norwood, in the Bronx, okay? There wasn't a single student in that class, okay, who was performing at even the lowest level of the kids in our Upper Manhattan program, okay? These kids had A averages, okay, these were the honors kids in the class, and they were getting 20% of the questions right on this exam when they were starting to prepare for this exam. They couldn't add fractions, okay? I'm talking about the kids, the valedictorian of this middle school, okay? These kids could not do basic arithmetic, all right? And there are schools like this, especially in the Bronx. The Bronx is the educational hellhole of this city, okay? There are schools all across the Bronx okay, where kids cannot do basic math, okay? They have difficulty with basic reading passages. And to say that we're going to treat all these schools differently, treat them the same, look at their grades the same way, is, I think, a very false way to look at the problem. We have to be honest about the educational inequality between different schools. So it was, it was just a really
Jonathan's taught in the Bronx for many years, not just at the High School of American Studies, but also at Christopher Columbus, right? Do you want to respond to that?
If I could. First of all, I don't know, and I absolutely believe you saw exactly what you saw. I know that my neighborhood has some rough schools. 80 is in my neighborhood, and it hasn't done particularly well. But the top students there have made really good students in American Studies over the years. Not the entire top, but the top. We get students, and they're getting in based on the test, from every crummy school in District 10, and it doesn't sound fair, but we get that there are kids in these schools who really perform. I regret saying crummy. It's not what I meant, but I understand what you're saying. I understand what you saw. But when we're talking about top performers, we know that one test doesn't necessarily capture the depth of creativity, of knowledge, of dedication, that's a one-dimensional picture of what's out there, and there's a lot more. On our task force, I was one of the people who didn't like this idea to start with, and there may be some people in the room who were there when this happened, but we were having a discussion about why it might be a problem to have exactly the kinds of kids that you were talking about. And the conversation shifted. A teacher from one of the big three, Stuyvesant or Bronx Science, was talking, the conversation shifted to ELLs. And he said, if a kid comes in and their math is good and they're really dedicated, we can work with somebody whose language needs a lot of work. And it's really true. In fact, he said teachers are delighted to work with them. And then we talked a little bit about the kids we'd run into coming out of tougher schools. When they fought their way to the top of a difficult situation, came every day, did all the work, despite all the distractions and all the temptations to go elsewhere. Those students are a delight to work with when they're going to work that hard. We're not talking about all of the students coming in from a top performers program, and top performers would certainly include kids who are from schools who already get in. But that kind of dedication just makes a teacher's life a pleasure.
I want to point out that Michael works very hard to identify kids that you're talking about in the schools that are very rough.
I just want to say one thing. When I was at MS-80 for the prior 5 years, not a single kid had gotten into the specialized high schools from that school. And that year, so to say that there were kids at Lehman, at the American Studies School at Lehman College is not true. Because maybe they got one kid, recently into that school. But and we went around and talked to principals. Oh, it was you?
Yeah, it wasn't recent.
Oh,
2010.
2010.
MSA graduate, HSAS graduate.
Oh, great. Congratulations. Wait, 2010 from HSAS?
Yes.
Okay, all right, so that's earlier than what I'm talking about, because so you entered in 2006 or something like that?
2006.
Okay, all right, so that's...
Oh
that's
my, we gotta be careful,
Right.
Everybody's gonna be...
All right, so that's before what I'm... But, and that year, I went around and personally spoke to principals at schools throughout the Bronx. We found one school in University Heights that had one kid who made it into Brooklyn Tech that year. The principal went to Brooklyn Tech at that school, and she had a little Brooklyn Tech diorama on her desk, and they pushed kids. They had teachers who were helping prepare those kids to get into those schools. It just doesn't happen. There are a large number of schools throughout the city that are sending no kids to the specialized high schools because they're just not prepared to take this exam. Even with a year of preparation, they can't get prepared to take this exam. They're so far behind in their basic skills that's tested on this exam. So I would just be careful about that because, and also in Sean Corcoran's report, there was a Wall Street Journal article about this, there were feeder schools that send a lot of kids to these specialized high schools, and there's a reason for that. Those kids are well prepared to begin to study for this exam. And at many of the schools, probably most in the Bronx, that's not true. If you go to Bronx Science, 14% of Bronx Science comes from the Bronx. Okay, they have this elaborate busing system. They have these Bronx Science buses, and they're famous. The Bronx people get so upset. They have these flat front buses, okay, that take kids up to the Bronx. All right, it makes the community there so upset. All these kids are coming from Queens. They're not coming from the Bronx, and why isn't that happening? Because the kids aren't ready there. Even with the DREAM program, even with other programs that are doing outreach in these communities, kids are not able to get up to speed because they lack basic skills. They can't do arithmetic. And so I just want to
Can I respond to that? Yeah, I mean, and this is
And then Ed, we have to give Ed a chance to
I
reply too.
just respond to this one quickly. I mean, I agree with everything that Jonathan said, and I think that you've just made the best argument that there is up here for changing the admissions process, because you're right, there are kids who are not prepared to take the test. That doesn't mean that they're not the kids who should be best served by these schools. If you are a valedictorian, if you are persevering in one of those schools that you've just described, you should be able to get into one of the best high schools in New York City. And if the high schools, right as they are right now, can't serve those kids, then those high schools are the things that need to change. Not, and yes, these kids are, and yes, and you know exactly Jonathan's example. That yes, you can take the ELL kid who might need to get up to speed when they have all of these amazing other skills. It's the same with these kids who are persevering. They have skills that these tests are not measuring. They are doing well in schools despite the odds, and they are meritorious for other reasons, and we need to find measures that look for that.
And there are many wonderful schools. There's Bard, there's Beacon, there's all kinds of wonderful schools.
Let's let Ed have a chance. We haven't let Ed talk much yet.
Well, as you see, this is a complicated issue, and a lot of this also is, as I'm listening to my fellow panelists, there's a lot of anecdotal information here. And I really need to go back to my statement about root causes of this issue. And yeah, the fact that many of these students that Mike has cited are not ready for the test, that's just to surface it. Not only are many of these students not prepared for the specialized high school test, they're not even prepared to be proficient in the day-to-day curriculum. And I have all the data right here in front of me that tells me that on the grade 7 ELA and math exam, over 83% of our Black and Hispanic students are not proficient. They don't even meet the level 3 proficiency. So while I appreciate, I am sure there are top achievers in all of our schools who may come close, even some who would be able to flourish at the school, but I believe the great majority are not adequately prepared to even master the existing curriculum. And that's the core issue. So, you know, there's a lot of fine-tuning and nuances to all this, and you can find truths on both sides, but for me, it goes back to the core issue. Are our kids, regardless of color, prepared to flourish in our specialized high schools? And I think, again, we must do a better job at preparing all of our kids, and especially our Black and Hispanic kids, so that they can excel in mastering the curriculum.
A New York Times editorial a couple years ago called the test poorly designed. This was in support of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund complaint. The test also heavily favors those who can afford extensive tutoring and has not been shown to be a good predictor of student performance in high school. And then a student at Jonathan's school, at the High School of American Studies, found that 77% of the white students paid for test prep, and only 18% of the Black and Latino kids did. What do you say to people who say you have to spend a lot of money on test prep? Anybody?
I believe there's absolutely some truth to it, but it's not the whole story. And, you know, it's interesting because since I knew I was going to be invited to this panel discussion, I've been kind of listening to all the city council testimony. I've been, you know, reading the UFT task force report to kind of get a broad perspective of what they're thinking and the, I guess, reasoning behind the positions that people are taking. And a number of testimonies, I kept hearing how successful the DREAM program was, the summer discovery program were, and then in whispered and hushed tones I hear, but there's a lack of funding. A lack of funding. Well, then get the funding that you need so that all students who want to take these courses and this preparation should get it free of charge. I don't get it. You're either committed to diversity or you're not. You can't use the money issue as an excuse. For me, you know, it's just disingenuous and misleading. If diversity is as important as it is, and I believe it is, and I think everyone here believes it is, then put the dollars up and remove that as an obstacle to creating the kind of diversity that we want.
You want to reply, Jonathan?
Not so much to reply, because I agree with a lot of what you said, and I think that programs like Michael's in Washington Heights and Brooklyn are really good things, and that putting the money into those programs and seeing what made them work better in the past, because I think they did, then now would be interesting. But at the same time, and this is a test design issue, and this is not, I don't think it's a bone of contention, there are teachers in my school who proctor the SHSAT, and they say that they walk into a room and they watch students sit down, and the exam has two parts, and they don't tell you when to move from one part to another. There's no every other test, AP tests and Regents, they tell you when you should move to sections or they give you instructions. Here they let you go. And the prepped kids open up their booklets, flip them deep inside to the questions that they know they should be doing first. And the smart local kids just open the book to the first page and they don't finish. That this is not measuring aptitude, this is measuring preparation. And a test, and I think everybody agreed that having some more alignment with what they actually do would help. In addition, and I can't skip this, having scrambled paragraphs as a question. This one question in particular, which is nothing that ever comes up as a skill in middle school, in high school, or in life, has to go. And just on the preparation, again, the prep kids, they look for them, they make up some kind of fancy chart. But by the way, they'll give you 5 sentences, they'll label those sentences G, H, I, and J. They will give you a paragraph, and the multiple choices are then R, S, T, U, V. So even if you get them in order, you're playing a little logic puzzle to put the right letter in the right letter, which doesn't match the right letter. This is, I'm sorry. I strongly believe a lot of what I say. This one is much smaller, but it's absolute nonsense. It's time for that to
go. Michael, that's going to reply.
I just wanted to say a couple of things. First of all, I think every test measures preparation. Okay, so if you're talking about familiarity with the test design, first of all, the Department of Education releases a student handbook, okay, in June. Okay, that's distributed to every school. It's supposed to be handed out by guidance counselors to students so that they can prepare over the summer. There are 2 excellent practice exams in each student handbook for the kids to take. There's also the DREAM program, which has thousands of kids in it, okay? And they're low-income kids, because they're screened based on low income. There's no racial criteria to enter into the DREAM program. So there are lots of kids who are taking the test and doing well, who are not paying for test prep, but they're in this free test prep program. My program is much smaller, but we're doing a similar thing. I think we do it better.
They got a 46% pass rate.
Yeah, they have a 40, the DREAM program. The DREAM program has a 46% pass rate, and since the admissions to the DREAM program was opened up, where they removed the racial criteria, the number of low-income kids at the specialized high schools has skyrocketed, okay, since that happened in 2007. Yeah.
63% of Brooklyn Tech.
Right, 63% of Brooklyn Tech is Title I. At Stuyvesant, I think it's like 43.
Yep.
Yeah. And if you look at schools like Bard and Beacon, it's low 20s, it's 30%, something like that, of the kids who are getting in are in these low-income categories. So I think the problem is that, exactly like Ed said, these programs need to be expanded so that kids have an opportunity to prepare for this test, to learn the skills that they need to learn to do well on the exam. I do think it's a problem that so many kids are walking in and taking that test for the first time when they sit down on test day, because you can't do well on the test if you just sit down and you take it for the first time. So that's absolutely true. But there are opportunities to take practice exams, to get prepared. I think there needs to be a bigger education effort, especially in Black and Hispanic communities. I think it's very dependent on what middle school you go to, whether you have a guidance counselor who's telling you about this exam early enough, who's giving you the books that you need to prepare for this test. And I think the idea that these tests are high-stakes exams is false, because this exam is an option, okay? This is an option in addition to the regular high school process, okay? Kids do a list of 12 schools that they want to go to. They submit that in December. That's a very regular process. And I have to tell you something, the kids in my program have a harder time getting into the screened high schools than they do into the specialized high schools. Because screened schools don't want to take kids from crappy middle schools in District 4. Okay? That's East Harlem. All right? These kids have a difficult time. That the screened high school admissions process is so enormously complicated, okay, that parents, single parent households, okay, parents who are working multiple jobs, just don't have the time to figure that out. And that's what they're left. Sometimes it's just easier to prepare for this exam, okay, and have an opportunity to go to these schools than it is to get into these screened high schools. So.
But I think that's also the case for the Asian American and the immigrant families,
Yes.
Yeah.
that they can figure out how to prepare for the test, but they can't figure out how to get into Beacon.
Right.
Jonathan, you want to?
Yeah, and it's off topic, but it's on topic. I think that part of the enormous pressure on this test, and it's really gone up in the last 5-10 years, is that we really need more quality options and enough seats, high school seats and quality high schools in every district. Some of this discussion is an artificial product of an artificial shortage of really good seats in really good schools. A member of our committee, the chapter leader at Stuyvesant, tells the story when he was a kid growing up on Pelham Parkway, that he went to Columbus instead of going to Bronx Science, and Columbus had a fine honors program. Every neighborhood high school did. We don't even have neighborhood high schools in a lot of places. The good honors programs aren't there. During our conversation, Clara pointed out half our high schools don't give chemistry and physics. This is a real, I think there's a much bigger discussion about needing good high schools everywhere. It doesn't take care of this, but I think it's something important that we should all agree on.
So I just want to respond to a couple of things quickly. One is the pamphlet that the Department of Education gives out, which says that the test is scored, that the two portions, the verbal and the math, it says they count equally. The first thing that anybody learns in test prep is that you can do really, really well on one side and really poorly on the other, and get in better than somebody who can who does medium well on both. So obviously, yes, you can read the pamphlet and say, oh, I just have to start from the beginning and go to the end. No one who's test prep will do that. And I also just want to add, I think that losing test prep as a prerequisite to get into your high school was good for everybody. Our kids need to be focused on learning what actually, the academics in schools, they're already preparing for state tests. This throws a whole other test on top. So expanding, yes, as long as this is the measure to get into specialized high schools, and it's the only measure, of course, you need to put in the funds to make sure that everybody has that access. So that I completely agree with. But why do we all need to be spending, I'm a mother, the last thing I want is to have to send my kid in addition to whatever homework at school she has and preparing for state tests, to then have to also send her to hours and hours after school, summers, to invest money in doing test prep to get into a school. That's not what I would, as a parent, would want to focus on, and I think it will benefit all children to have measures that are already, they're already taking the state test, they already have grades, to start focusing on some of the things that they already are working hard towards, and to put more effort into that and less into test prep.
Ed, your kids
Sure.
didn't go to the specialized schools, right?
No. I had two of my children who went to the school that I was a principal of at Curtis High School, and they were in screen programs. I never encouraged them to take the test or to go there. They never indicated any desire to go there because they knew they would get an excellent education at the zone school. Since the whole concept of screened programs was kind of interjected into this conversation, and I know that's not the focus of this, it's worth mentioning that if you take a careful look at all of the data in terms of the racial diversity in our screened programs, that too is appalling. That too is appalling. And here, we use multiple criteria. So that kind of supports my original argument that, you know, we have to go back to the root cause, that our kids are not being adequately prepared in all of our schools. And some of the things that are grossly missing, and Jonathan, I'm retired a year and a half, so maybe you can give me some good news, that the system, our school, New York City system, has never had a coherent curriculum for the teachers to use, and I know the UFT has taken a very strong position and criticized the Department of Ed for not having a coherent and rigorous curriculum that can be used by teachers as a guide to make sure that the materials that need to be covered are covered, and teachers and administrators are left to scramble on their own to organize a curriculum on the run while they do lesson plans, and it is just unpardonable that in the largest and supposedly the greatest city in the country that we do not have a well-defined, coherent, to date. I understand that they're just working on it, and that is one of the primary tools for teachers to ensure that they're covering the materials in a coherent and rigorous way. And Jonathan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I've heard rumors that curriculum are on the way. I haven't actually met a living witness who's seen one.
So, if I may ask a question, would you agree the lack of having a curriculum that we need, the kind of curriculum, is a hindrance, an impediment to good teaching?
I absolutely agree. I think there's a lot more. I don't want to say
Right,
that's it, but that point is absolutely 100%
But
correct.
this conversation would not be complete without citing that as another contributing factor.
I agree.
I'm going to wrap this up quickly because Chris tells me we can see the video, and I do want to leave a little bit of time for questions from the audience. I just want to quickly ask Rachel what the status of your complaint is, and if you win, what happens?
Very good question. So the status is that it is currently under investigation by the Department of Education. This is the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. They've been investigating it for a few years, so we're hoping that we'll get some sort of outcome soon. So the actual hook for the Department of Education is obviously their funding. And the last thing that anybody wants to see is, OCR the Office for Civil Rights, and getting into a position where they would threaten to withhold funding from the New York City public schools. That would be a disaster. That is their sort of, that's their hook, like when they find somebody who violates the civil rights laws, and in this case it would be Title VI of the civil rights laws. It's one of the reasons that we've been advocating for change in the meantime, is that we think that, voluntary change, the state passing a law, the city maybe taking the 5 that are in schools that aren't subject to the law and making a change towards multiple measures before there's a decision from the Office of Civil Rights would be a good idea, so we don't ever have to handle that. Generally what they do when they find a violation or are about to find a violation is they work on some sort of agreement with the violator. And so my guess is in that case, if they find a violation, and we're pretty confident that they will, that there'll be conversations with the state and the city about how to change
But the
system.
state legislation to change the test has gone nowhere for, I mean, it's not gonna change, right? The state legislature's not gonna
So
do
there
anything.
has been an increase in support in the last, I'd say, year and a half. The lobbying efforts haven't been there, I don't think, and so that very well might change in terms of the support for the state law. I also hadn't heard of the newly introduced proposed legislation, so I don't know who introduced that or where the support is coming from, if there's any. Yeah, that was breaking news.
My read on it is that the state legislature's not gonna budge, but that if the feds make them, they might.
They certainly would, and we've just been trying to encourage them to make that move before the feds do, just because that's a
So
that's a
how many
nightmare.
of you have children who are going to take this exam sometime in the future? Okay, so it's not going to change this year. I think we can say that. It's not going to change next year. I think we can say that safely. Michael?
Microphone.
Sorry. I just want to point out there's a new RFP which could have potential consequences in redesigning the.
It's not actually new, that was.
No,
It was all right, so it's
hold on. They do an RFP every 5 years.
Yep.
To look at the test. There are changes in the RFP this year. They have an optional essay that they're taking solicitations
It's
for.
in there 5 years.
The RFP, the city actually confirmed that there was no change in the RFP. So the test that was in there 5 years ago too.
You know,
It's just
I'm
now
going
they
to
added
cut
it.
this off because this is in the weeds.
I've read both RFPs. You
there-
can look at
what-
them. It is very different.
There is the potential for the city to change the test somewhat.
Yes.
Yes, there
That's
always
fair
has
to
been.
say, yeah.
Okay.
So we're gonna,
We're gonna
here's
try
Chris.
to